And it's 6:03, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lorena. I'm an organizer with the Safe Streets Coalition of New Haven. We are hosting this discussion on parking minimums, ending parking minimums in New Haven and in our state, and the effects that that could have on a multitude of other aspects of our city life. The Safe Streets Coalition of New Haven, we are a diverse citywide group of pedestrians, cyclists, public transit riders, and drivers who advocate for just, safe, accessible, and sustainable transportation in New Haven, focusing on underserved communities first. We envision a New Haven where all residents from all neighborhoods can safely and easily travel to anywhere they want to go without a car. Parking policy, as some of us may know very well, is a reflection of what we value as a society. And in cities across the state, across the country, New Haven included, we have continued to value cars over people. Most basically, parking minimums are local laws requiring property owners to provide and maintain a certain number of off-street parking spaces. And these rules inevitably result in more parking than we actually need. And our speakers tonight are going to be talking about that. So we have three people with a lot of expertise going to be providing some short presentations to us tonight. And then we'll have hopefully like almost half an hour for Q&A. We'll take a short break at 7. If you have to go at 7, no worries, but we are having an optional like 30-minute, 45-minute working session afterwards where anyone who wants to should feel free to stay. If there's enough of us, we'll break out into groups and we'll try to develop some type of action plan with concrete steps that we can take as advocates in the short term and the long term to work towards our goal of ending parking minimums in New Haven and maybe in other cities if you're coming from a different city. So that's the plan for the evening. I'll quickly introduce our three speakers. Thank you so much for your time, all of you. We're so grateful as advocates in New Haven to have you joining us this evening. First off, we have Luke Reynolds, who's the Deputy Coordinator of Desegregate Connecticut, which is a coalition dedicated to reforming statewide land use laws to create housing equity, inclusive prosperity, and a cleaner environment. Previously, Luke worked on affordable housing developments in Seattle and focused on establishing a continuum of care for people experiencing homelessness. He's now a student at UConn. Thanks, Luke, for coming. Aaron Gill is also with us. He's a civil structural engineer and a licensed professional engineer with over 20 years of experience in engineering. Aaron also has a passion for urban planning and has lived in cities his entire life. Aaron currently serves as the vice chair of the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission. He's the chair of the Frog Hollow Neighborhood Revitalization Zone and a member of the Planning Action Committee for the redesign of the I-84 through Hartford. Aaron's other focus is the rehabilitation of historic blighted buildings in his Frog Hollow neighborhood. And in his free time, Aaron enjoys walking through his neighborhood with his wife and 2 sons and the many neighborhood parks that surround them. And finally, we have Anika Singh Lemar, Clinical Associate Professor of Law at Yale Law School, where she teaches the Community and Economic Development Clinic. The clinic represents affordable housing developers, fair housing advocates, small businesses, and others. Previously, she practiced law at a Connecticut law firm and a New York City legal services organization. And as a law student, she was co-founder of Next City, a highly regarded urban affairs magazine where she later served on the board of directors. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And Luke, please kick it off for us.
Okay, so two questions. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me here and having Desegregate Connecticut here. This is such a great coalition that you all have. On the call are a couple of volunteers, both Robbie and Karen. Karen's actually an expert on parking, so she will be instrumental in the in our Q&A later. But I just wanted to provide a quick overview of Desegregate Connecticut, talk about some of the impacts of mandatory parking minimums, talk about the research that we've been doing, and then quickly go into, what we're suggesting as Desegregate Connecticut and as kind of a statewide organization. So Desegregate Connecticut, we are a coalition of neighbors and nonprofits who accept that land use laws are segregative and need to change. Our coalition is broad. We have about 45 plus organizations that are already, signed on to that, very stance and mission. And, we run the gamut from housing organizations to social working to preservation and land use societies. So we're really, happy to extend our coalition. And we're working to change statewide land use policy through legislation. And we're focusing on three lenses here, which are really applicable to our conversation around parking: equity, economy, and environment. And part of our platform and part of what we're proposing for the state is to, increase our housing diversity, because Connecticut has encourages way too many single family homes. We want to, produce more housing and make housing supply easier. And then we want to, reform some of the processes which often inhibit development or sometimes are driven by emotion or arbitrary decisions. And I encourage you all to check out our website, Desegregate Connecticut, which will kind of talk about more of our platform that I won't go into tonight, or check us out on Twitter. But yeah, please, look at what we've been researching and looking at. One of these lenses is equity. And, a lot of things we get is like, are you stirring the pot? Just let the local towns figure it out. They deserve to, have their right to make their communities more equitable. And that's true. But, segregation exists in Connecticut and, right here, like in New Haven, has one of the highest increases in income segregation since 1970. And Fairfield County is the most segregated place in the entire country. So thinking, something needs to change. And this is a study from Brown, which shows that New Haven and Milford area has actually increased its income segregation since 1970. And it ranks in the top 10 nationwide out of metropolitan areas. And we can talk about these slides later. I just wanted to provide a quick overview for now. But, we realize that we're in a moment of recognition, both, an awakening of racial equity and also socioeconomic equity, not to mention that our climate is dying on us. And now is the change, we believe, for reform throughout our state, if it hasn't always been. So quickly jumping into the impacts of parking mandates. It's our belief in general that there is no need for excessive parking requirements. And we can go more into, what is excessive, because I think that definition is constantly changing and it really truly does depend on where you are, but we can talk a little bit about what we found. So looking at the equity lens here, take New Haven, for example, 29% of New Haven residents do not have cars. And this was from 2016. So, the statistics might have changed. And the average, vehicles per household is 1. So just thinking about that as far as parking and rentable spaces go, garage parking typically costs renters about $142, and it's a little bit less for, off-street parking that's not garage. But this correlates into a 17% increase in rent. So if you are somebody who's living in a rental housing unit and you don't have a car, but the developer, the property owner of that rental unit is still required to have those parking spaces, that cost is being translated onto your rent. And that's a massive equity problem. And that's just encouraging, an auto-centric culture. And there are actually studies, if anybody's interested. In Minneapolis, they eliminated parking requirements, and they found that rents, on a standard unit that was $1,200 dropped to about $1,000 within a year or so. So I mean, like it actually, does have an impact. So now thinking about the economic pitch, because equity gets you in the door, unfortunately it doesn't get you all the way, and we have to start thinking about how it actually impacts our economy. And parking mandates are inhibitive of our economic growth. Middle housing is less likely to develop. So when we're talking about middle housing, we're talking about the development of 2 to 4 family property units, that fit into any residential neighborhood. And the problem is, if a developer comes in and wants to do a 4 family unit, a 4-plex, and they come in and they want to put it in a transit oriented district, and then the town requires 2 parking spaces for each 1-bedroom apartment. Now that developer has to produce 8 units of parking, which either means that the size of their 4-plex has to decrease, or they have to do in garage parking, or et cetera. So it just makes development less likely to happen. Another interesting note is we'll have fewer pedestrian economies, because this doesn't just affect housing. This affects our restaurants, our supermarkets, our commercial businesses. So when we require parking for all of our properties, that means that we're encouraging the use of cars, and we're spreading out our commercial businesses, which means that we're driving everywhere. And we as a state need to recognize that people actually want pedestrian economies. And I think actually COVID has been a good indicator that people like eating outside, they like going to different restaurants, which we should start to encourage, and taking away some of those parking spaces would enable that growth. And maybe Aaron can talk about that later too, because Hartford experimented. Another thing that I wanted to just quickly note upon is Connecticut's an old state. We have a lot of old buildings. Old buildings have been grandfathered. A lot of old buildings have been grandfathered into the parking requirements. But anytime that these buildings want to be revitalized, they now have to comply with these mandates, or these parking minimums, which means that they either have to buy the place next door and make it into parking, or they have to, cut their building in half. And that's a simplification, but that's really a huge concern, and we're not revitalizing old buildings the way we should. And there was one study, I think 4 years ago, that the city of Hartford was losing $50 million in potential tax revenue. So there is a huge economic impact. And then the most under talked about impact is the environment. By the way we currently have our land use laws, we're sprawling out into our green fields. We're developing single family houses on large lots with lots of parking requirements, which means that we are relying on cars. We are driving to our schools. We are driving to our work. We are driving to just go see our neighbors. And we should, if towns want to do that they can do that, but we shouldn't, as a state, or, even as our towns, we shouldn't make that happen because of parking mandates. The more that we drive, the more that we pollute our air, the more erosion that we have, and water runoff, all contributing to climate change. And this is a map by our friends at Yukon Clear, which shows the impervious land cover, and you can see all the red and the yellow. That's all area that we've started to pave in our state. So we're literally paving over what we love, which is our green, our greenery, and our beautiful ecosystem that we have. I know I'm flying through this, and we can talk about it more later, but we have good presenters to talk. So we've been doing research statewide. We started with all the towns in the state, and we found that 84 towns require at least 2 units or 2 spaces of parking for each 1 family, or single unit dwelling. And then a lot of states, just like East Haven, require more, like 3 spaces, or even some towns require 4 spaces. And so we've actually taken this map, and what we've actually done is we've started to do it district by district throughout the state. And we don't actually have the data released yet, but we've been looking at, by each zone district, how much parking is required. Because while it might be, in the commercial corridor only 1 or 2, it actually might be likely in the suburbs to be more, which is restricting our ability to produce denser communities. And our findings are that the wealthiest towns in the state, probably no surprise to anybody, impose the highest minimum parking requirements, and this has an exclusionary effect. And then some other studies have come out in the last year or so that young people are waiting to get driver's licenses, and that people of all ages are actually declining to get driver's licenses at all, which is weird, right? When you think about it, like we are encouraging an auto-centric culture by the way that we require parking, yet people don't want cars anymore. And, and because we have all this space of parking, we're inhibiting the growth of other things like public transit and walkable communities. So what we're suggesting is we're not trying to prohibit parking, but what we are trying to do is we're trying to cap parking requirements. So we're trying to say, and to be honest, if you look at this, you will say, that's a lot as it is, like 2 parking spaces for a 2-bedroom. We don't need 2 parking spaces, but our thought is, the state can set, this is our proposal for the state. It's not a proposal for towns. We encourage towns to adopt less than this. But what we're trying to say is that the state should put a cap on it. So the state should put a cap so that towns can't require any more than 2 spaces for a 2-bedroom or any more than 1 space for a studio. And then the accessory dwelling unit, which is really, coming up as a popular development for a lot of single-family homes to put an accessory dwelling unit in. The problem is a lot of towns require 2 additional spaces of parking for each accessory dwelling unit. So how can you put a dwelling unit in your backyard for your elderly parents or for your your neighbors or for some extra cash if now on top of the development that you have to build, you also have to find 2 more spaces of parking. So that's our proposal. And it boils down to, if you want to add a 3rd space, you can. If you have a teenage daughter, if you have your mother-in-law coming to live with you and they need an extra space, you should be able to do that. But the government or local government should not require you to do that. So that's kind of our proposals in a nutshell. And I'll just close with this last slide, which is saying that our land use laws in Connecticut, they're driven from the state. So the state has the power to set the land use laws and how we zone our communities, and they're not preordained. So we can actually change this, and we have an opportunity to do so, to set a baseline so that more towns can fall under compliance, and that we can start to desegregate our communities and also help save our environment, and we can benefit economically from it. So I'm so interested to see what everybody else has to say, and I look forward to our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Luke. Aaron, you're up.
All right, how are we doing with the screen share?
Great.
Perfect. Well, good evening, all. Lorena, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for hosting this, and thank you for having me. I definitely want to say thanks to Luke, and I for what it's worth, I strongly support the work that Desegregate CT is doing, and I think we're blessed in a lot of ways to have the leadership of Sarah Bronin taking on that challenge. She was instrumental, frankly, in helping us do a lot of the changes that we did to our planning and zoning ordinances here in the city of Hartford. Although we're always we're sad to lose her efforts, we're happy that the state is going to benefit from those. So Luke and Sarah, keep up the fight. It's definitely a valuable effort. A little bit what I'm going to talk about is going to seem slightly repetitive to some of the things that you saw in Luke's slide. When Lorena and I first talked about this, one of the things that she mentioned was that this group was hoping in part to kind of firm up arguments to make with your local leaders there in New Haven, or convince local officials that this was an important thing. So I didn't think it was necessarily a bad thing to kind of repeat some of the stuff and maybe present slightly different versions of the arguments, or from a slightly different perspective. Ideally just helping you all brainstorm or think of new ways to present some of these issues and challenges. And obviously, if we don't fully understand the issues, it's hard to make the arguments for or against something. So I just include this headshot to show the effects that COVID has had on all of us. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everybody's hanging in there. Stay healthy, stay safe. For what it's worth, my experience starts about 20 years or so ago. You can probably see from my background, I'm a University of Michigan grad, and started right away in an engineering firm back in Michigan. And the firm that I worked for, we did, essentially we were hired by many local municipalities who weren't large enough to have their own engineering staff. So a good part of my job was reviewing plans from an engineering perspective, helping developers correct their mistakes when they weren't meeting local municipality requirements. And pretty early on, I realized what a devastating effect the parking requirements were having on some of these townships. So on one hand, we were dealing with water erosion issues and flooding issues, but on the other side, we were saying, well, we want big box stores and we want retail. And by the way, they have to have massive parking lots. Well, all those massive parking lots kept leading to other issues. And so I started asking myself, well, why do we have these parking requirements and are they really necessary? And what I found was, and what I found for 20 years now, is that if you ask, most local leaders, why do we have these parking requirements? Very few of them can give you any type of answer. It's been that way for so long. It's just so ingrained in our culture that very few people who make these decisions even understand why those decisions have been made or why we continue to make those decisions. Occasionally someone will say, well, retail has to have it to survive. For years, I typically would challenge people and I say, well, in the 90s and 2000s, if it was a Friday or Saturday night, the movie theaters were going to be packed. You'd go to a local movie theater, you'd see that half of the parking lot was still empty. They were absolutely full and half of the parking lots were still empty. Or I would challenge some of our town folks. I'd say, drive around on Black Friday, go to the big box stores, go to any retail place and look and see how much parking is just not being used on the busiest day of the year. Fast forward 10, 20 years where box retail is starting to decrease. You have more and more online shopping. I think this problem is just, further exacerbated by kind of our decades of poor land use, if you will. So the other often answer you might get from local officials as well, we need to make sure, especially in urban areas, we need to make sure that workers can get to work and have some place to park. And we can talk about the contradiction that has with public transportation and walkability and bikeability, and how those two things are not necessarily going hand in hand. So, again, why do we have these parking minimums in urban areas, especially in Hartford and New Haven, as cities, as local hubs for our areas? Why do we have these parking minimums that really all they do is encourage commuter culture? We have an abundant amount of parking. It's cheap, it's easily accessible, and it just encourages people to hop in a single occupancy vehicle and drive as far as they need to, pull up as close as they can to work, hop in after work, get back in the car and leave the city again. And really, I think that's the opposite of what we want in our urban areas, right? And so in general, the parking minimums discourage urban living. It also discourages use of public transportation. Again, these are things that Luke started to touch on. We as a state are I think, finally starting to make some better decisions when it comes to investment in infrastructure projects that are related to transportation. You guys in New Haven have kind of always been the envy of many folks in having so many train connections. That's recently been even improved more with the Hartford line. Up until COVID, my wife was a daily commuter from Hartford down to New Haven via the train. And it's been great. It's something that would give us the ability to go from a two vehicle family to a one vehicle family. And yet, and yet these things are working against each other. So as the state is making more infrastructure dollars available for public transport, we need to realize that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot if we continue to have all these parking minimums. It just from a livability standpoint as well, these what I call seas of asphalt, you walk and you just see acres and acres and acres of asphalt. We all feel it when we walk through the neighborhoods, through our urban environments. It degrades our cities in so many ways. There's no life there. Instead of having something that you want to go to, it's just something that you're waiting to walk past. The amount of parking also creates additional cost for the land, obviously, and then also a loss in tax revenue. And this is something that Luke touched on as well. Professor Norman Garrick from UConn, if you haven't looked into any of his studies, I would strongly encourage you to. And actually, Luke, my understanding, I'll correct that figure just a little bit. My understanding is that loss of tax revenue for the city of Hartford back in 2014 dollars was $50 million per year for just the downtown parking alone. So that doesn't include the parking for many of our large institutions outside of downtown and all the other surface lots that we have as well. I tend to think New Haven is slightly better off financially than the city of Hartford is. But I, on a daily basis, think about what our city could do with an additional $50 million per year. Looking at the cost another way, Professor Garrick estimated that each parking spot in the city of Hartford cost the city approximately $1,200 per year. So when I have this discussion with some of our leaders from our institutions in our neighborhood here, I often point to that figure and I challenge them to, I say, you know, go out and just walk past your parking lot and start to add up, just count every stripe, every parking spot there, and start to count, you know, start to add up that $1,200 per parking spot. Every parking spot that you have as an institution in the city costs this city $1,200 per year. And it helps give people, I think, a different perspective and a better understanding when you start to be able to put a monetary value to it. You know, I won't call out any specific institutions, but I've talked to a few of the CEOs of some of the institutions in our neighborhood, and I asked them, I said, you know, you probably have one of the closest parking spots of anybody in your institution. How many parking spots do you pass just walking to the office? I said, you know, now imagine how much you probably just walked past the salary of a teacher. Or, you know, and so it gives, I think it changes people's perceptions a little bit and gives them a different way to think about the real cost of these parking spots. On top of that, this is, in my mind, something that is often forgotten as well. It's just the high cost of municipal infrastructure. You know, we often hear people complaining about speed bumps, about potholes, and how horrible the New England roads are and how hard it is to drive. But we often forget how expensive it is to maintain our road system, especially in an environment like New England, where we have lots of freeze thaws, we have lots of plowing that's required, we have salting, etc. It's very expensive to maintain our roads. And when we have all this parking, which encourages all this additional driving, that further drives up our maintenance costs. And all these costs continue to be paid for by our municipalities. You know, Hartford, New Haven, we don't get assistance from our suburban neighbors for all the degradation that the suburban commuters do to our roads. On top of the fact that, you know, further spacing out our developments also leads to higher utility costs. So providing water, power, things like that. Luke also touched on this. There's huge environmental costs associated with parking. And, you know, hopefully once we get past COVID, we can all start thinking about the very real challenge that we're faced with climate change. But building roads, paving, asphalt parking lots, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with both the manufacturing of asphalt and the placement. But we also have the additional greenhouse gas emissions associated with all of the additional miles driven by cars, because again, we're encouraging this lifestyle. And then one thing that I think Luke touched on that doesn't get talked about a whole lot is you also have a great deal of stormwater runoff from parking lots. About 20 years ago, the federal government tried to begin addressing the degradation of our storm water system and the amount of pollutants that we're putting from our stormwater runoff into our water bodies, and wash off from parking lots and roads has been found to be one of the largest contributors of pollution to our water bodies. So there's now quite a bit of cost associated with trying to deal with that stormwater runoff. We'll talk about that a little bit further down as well. And not just the additional runoff, but like I mentioned, also the oils, the fluids, the auto fluids, the salts, and things like that that are all getting washed into our water bodies. And some of these things actually are ending up in our food chain as well, which is also scary. And of course, right on cue, my toddler decides to show his face because I'm now talking. So excuse the background disruption there. So how does this all relate to kind of the topic here of housing costs? And again, these are some things that Luke started to touch on. So developer costs, right? The cost of the land. Is there land even available to do a development that you're hoping to do, especially given many of the parking minimum requirements? If assuming you find a piece of land, you can afford to purchase that piece of land. One thing that's not discussed that much is grading or earth movement. From an engineering perspective, it's very expensive to move soil. Soil is heavy. It's not easily done. It takes large amounts of equipment, and most parking lots are relatively flat, so you have to flatten things out. It also presents a challenge to end up disposing of soil. If you do, most soil in our urban areas, just because of the history of our urban areas, it's considered contaminated. It's not easy in general to find places to dispose of soil. It's expensive to transport soil because it's so heavy and voluminous. And then on top of that, if you're assuming that the soil is contaminated, you either have to treat that contamination or find some place that will accept your contaminated soil. So again, additional costs for developments. The general asphalt materials, most parking lots are multi-layered, multiple layers of asphalt. You have multiple layers of gravel beneath that. We started to talk about the stormwater retention and detention. Just about every municipality in the country now has stormwater retention or detention requirements for developers. So we say if you're going to make an impervious surface, you have to do something with the stormwater runoff that's generated from that impervious surface. And typically that involves some type of retention, where you're retaining a portion of that water on site, which means that you either have to have enough land on your site to do some type of retention or detention basin to store that stormwater after a storm, or you have to dig down further and you have to put in an underground system, which again adds more cost. And a lot of communities are also now requiring developers to do stormwater treatment. What that often looks like is what's a lot of times referred to as a first flush. So we know that initial rains, first few minutes, washes off the most contaminants from parking lots. So there are ways that we try to essentially retain those pollutants on site, so that they don't get into our waterways. All of this then leads to long-term maintenance that the developer also has to pay for, whether it's repaving, whether it's resealing the parking lot, even things like snow plowing. If you have a parking lot that's twice as big, you're going to spend twice as much money on snow plowing. The stormwater treatment, I'll say facilities, often have to be maintained as well on a somewhat annual or regular basis, which again adds cost. Obviously, all of these costs get passed on to the housing unit itself. Somewhat, if you think about it, if you continue to think about it moving forward, the parking lots that we have, they reduce the amount of land that's available for development. Less land means you're driving up the land costs. Driving up the land costs increases the cost of development, which increases the cost of housing, which kind of furthers this cycle. So it's becomes an ugly cycle, and we see the affordability crisis that we've gotten into. Many markets, most medium-sized American cities, Hartford is a good example. New Haven may be a little bit less because of the market there, but most mid-sized American cities, market rents cannot support the cost of development. So developers don't build, which means we end up with less housing supply. As Luke mentioned, housing supplies continue to grow both in urban and suburban areas. As demand grows, supply doesn't, housing prices continue to go up. City of Hartford. I am proud, I think, to say that City of Hartford was one of the first cities in the US to take the step of eliminating parking minimums. Again, I think as we're mentioning, this is not a small thing. And because of some trepidation, I'll say, from some folks in the city, whether it was some planning and zoning commissioners or some community members, essentially we did this, I'll say, in two phases. So back in 2015, we eliminated parking minimums in all downtown districts. And the thought process was we have a fair amount of density there. We have several parking garages. We have an embarrassing number of surface parking lots, an embarrassing number of surface parking lots and parking spots in general. We can give this a try in downtown. The common perception is that there isn't enough parking in the city already. So what we heard the most in 2015 is, well, Hartford doesn't have enough parking. Thanks to work like that done by Professor Garrick, we know that, as a matter of fact, the city of Hartford has more parking per capita than almost any other city in America. So, and I suspect, not I suspect, it's most cities have this affliction where we actually have a lot of parking, way too much parking, but the common perception is that there's never enough parking. For some reason, we as a society or as a culture, if we drive into an urban area, we expect to be able to pull up immediately in front of wherever we go and walk right inside. And if we can't, then somehow there's not enough parking. But if we drive to a suburban mall and we park half an acre away, you know, we can walk 2 football fields to the front door of Sears, and that's just expected because it's a large mall and that's normal. And great, there's ample parking. So, you know, one of the, I think the common pushbacks you're going to get or hear from people is that there's not enough parking in the city. And so expect that argument, I'll say. After a couple of years, and we were able to show people that the world did not come to an end when we eliminated the parking minimums downtown, and several of us successfully advocated for eliminating parking minimums citywide. We again had some skeptical commissioners at the time. Some of the concerns that I heard was we literally had a commissioner say, well, how am I going to carry my groceries into my house? And I could talk for an hour about all the misperceptions that are there. We had a couple other people that said, well, this is going to destroy my neighborhood. And it was hard to really gauge what folks meant by that. There were a couple people that said, well, I just don't want street parking. You know, I don't want any cars parked on the street. I don't know if it's realistic to live in an urban area and not have street parking. I personally think it's an incredible waste of space. If you're going to have that much asphalt out there for our roadways anyways, we should use it, in my opinion. But again, here we are 3 years further into this, and lo and behold, the city of Hartford is still here, pandemic and otherwise, and the elimination of parking minimums has not ruined us all. So the one exception I'll point out is car dealerships. And of course, why is that one exception there? And it turns out it's mandated by state law. So we didn't have a say in that. Amy Chambers, our director of planning, I believe is on the call, but I had a chance to chat with her some. She is the one, her and her staff, that get to deal with on an everyday basis the developers that come to the city. So I picked her brain some as to what type of feedback she has gotten from developers, that they have gotten from developers. And essentially, it sounds like it has been, this change has been met with pleasure, you know, if you will. A lot of developers have realized that there's a lot more flexibility that they can use to develop their sites. We haven't gotten any pushback. You know, there's no developer that said, no, I really want a parking minimum. Developers do have the option, of course, as Luke pointed out, developers still have the option to place parking as they choose. I also, you know, I want to give kudos to Ms. Chambers and her staff. They have also taken on the mission, if you will, of helping to kind of change some of the culture here. So as developers come forward, Ms. Chambers and staff have encouraged, I see I didn't do a very good job of spell checking this, have encouraged have encouraged developers to think differently. I guess what we've heard is, you know, many developers are just so accustomed to doing parking minimums that they have to be pressed to rethink and realize, oh, you know, I can maybe make this product more economically beneficial for me as a developer, and more economically beneficial for the city, and provide more housing, or, you know, or more office space, and still meet the zoning requirements. So hey, this is great. myself and several other planning commissioners oftentimes will push developers further. We right now have before us a group that's actually looking to infill a large parking lot historically used for a movie theater. One of these seas of asphalt that we have in the city. And one of the questions that we as a commission posed to them was, you have reduced the amount of parking from other sites. This is located very close to the CT fast track. You're in a TOD or a transit oriented development zone. Do you still need this much parking? Please go back, study this further. Is there your parking numbers here even further? So we're trying to do this on multiple levels to help change the culture and the mindset of folks who are doing developments here in the city. Just kind of as a side note, and I think actually frankly ties well to what Luke touched on as well. One of the things that I'm hoping that we in the city can do, in the city of Hartford can do next, is I would really like us to begin to reduce the maximum allowable parking for developments. As we talk about how much each parking spot costs our city and our residents, I think it's again important to keep that in mind and say, well, if we currently allow 100 parking spots, how much extra revenue are we losing as a city if we allowed 75? If we went down to 75 or 50, or I don't know what the magic number is, but one of the things that I'm hoping that we'll do next is start to look at how to further reduce the maximum allowable as well. Real quick, oftentimes
Hey, Aaron, I just want to be mindful of time. Would it be okay if we moved on to Anika's presentation, and then it'd be great if you could share your slides for the group. I just want to make sure that we get a chance for Anika to speak, and then also a few questions, hopefully.
Sure. How about 2 minutes and I'll be done?
Okay, sure.
Okay. So just in the context of neighborhoods, this conversation often happens in the context of downtowns. Frog Hollow is a neighborhood I live in. It's a very old neighborhood. Most of the buildings here were built before the cars existed. Many buildings here have zero parking, have survived fine. This is just one example of an historic building vacated. We've had several developers over the years that tried to redevelop it, but could never meet the minimum parking requirements. As such, it sat here vacant. I was hoping that this is a building that would benefit from the elimination of parking minimums, and found out just this week that it's going to be demolished because it's no longer structurally capable. So this is some of the literal degradation you can see of our neighborhoods because of parking minimums. So we can talk about this later. Thank you, and sorry if I went long.
Okay, just going to share my screen if I can find it. Okay, great. Can everyone see and hear? So it's interesting that Aaron talked about needing the facts to convince local officials in New Haven, because I don't think that's really the problem in New Haven at all. And I'll talk a little bit in a little bit about things that have happened on the ground here in New Haven and steps that we need to take, I think, moving forward. So really briefly, we've already kind of heard this. Parking costs money, off-street parking mandates cost money. People kind of, at this point, I think, understand that structured parking costs money. Surface parking costs money too, for a lot of the reasons that Aaron described. And in the parts of Connecticut where there is demand and zoning for multifamily housing, it is totally typical for land to cost around $1 million per acre. And so there's just some back of the envelope math here on what that adds up to in terms of costs per space. It's important to recognize that these parking mandates are built on a landscape of exclusion. Our first speaker described middle housing as 2 to 4 units. Middle housing is really a much broader definition than that. and really includes everything in here in this middle range that is historically where we got affordability from. Row houses, townhouses, yes, fourplexes and the like as well. Smaller scale, 3-story type multifamily. And Connecticut, essentially for the most part, doesn't really zone for this stuff anywhere outside of a few center cities. And so the sort of natural market affordability that historically this country developed, we don't do anymore. And we do it really badly in Connecticut, where our minimum lot sizes for single family houses are drastically larger than they are in other parts of the country, including other parts of the country like Silicon Valley, which are known for their own exclusionary practices. You add on to that parking requirements, then obviously you're going to have affordability issues. So here's a couple of examples. This is Westport. It's kind of hard to read, but the next slide is easier. I include this one just because this is the parking requirement in Westport's affordable housing zone, which is to say that in their affordable housing zone, you might hope like, oh, they'll make things easier, but they don't. They have the exact same parking requirement in their affordable housing zone as they do for multifamily housing generally. And it's worth zooming in a little bit to see that for multifamily housing, Westport requires almost 2 spaces per unit. And for single family housing, they require 2 spaces per unit. Sorry, 2 spaces per unit for a 1-bedroom apartment. And then once you get to a 2-bedroom apartment in Westport, you're required to provide more parking than you would have to provide for a single family house. It is actually harder. And that's not just Westport. I mean, Westport's literally the worst when it comes to how things work in Connecticut, but they're certainly not alone. Town over in Fairfield, they've got a similar situation where for dwelling units for 1 to 4 families, so single family houses to 4plexes, you're required to have 2 parking spaces per family. And then the larger the development, so the more units that are in an apartment building, the more parking you have to provide per family. So if you're in a 10-unit apartment building, you've got to provide 2.5 parking spaces per family. And if you're in a yet larger building, I mean, I can't even fathom what the rationale for this is, that people who live in 20-unit apartment buildings somehow need more cars than people who live in smaller buildings. This is literally just exclusion. The upshot of those kinds of requirements is that people then need to seek discretionary approvals to do something different. And this is just an example of what happens in Connecticut when you seek discretionary approvals. A bunch of angry white people show up and laugh at how poor people are really evil. And that's true in Connecticut, but it's also true more widespread. It's a great book that came out last year about who it is who shows up at public hearings for zoning processes. It's largely focused on suburban Massachusetts, but not exclusively. They also included a bunch of small cities around Boston, not Boston itself, and found that at Planning and Zoning Commission hearings in those places, small cities other than Boston and suburbs of Boston, people who showed up were whiter, older, wealthier, and more opposed to the construction of affordable housing. And the very predictable result of that public participation process when it came to discretionary approvals where a developer was seeking to build something that wasn't permitted as of right was that you ended up with fewer units of housing, fewer affordable units, and more parking. Okay, so let's talk about let's sort of zoom in on New Haven really closely. So not too long ago, I think it was only about a year ago, it feels like a lifetime ago with the pandemic and everything, our city plan staff tried to replace parking minimums with parking maximums in 3 major commercial corridors in the city. And what happened? This happened. A lot of people showed up and said that higher density and less parking was going to cause gentrification. Heartwarming, intergenerational, racially diverse group of people who said no. Thankfully, there was in one neighborhood a group of people who came out and said, no, actually, like we really need to, our zoning kind of sucks. Can we fix it, please? And the 3 corridors that were being considered for this zoning, Whaley, Dixwell, and Grand, Dixwell and Grand didn't go through because people thought it would cause gentrification, contrary to most empirical evidence and common sense. But on Whaley Avenue, people wanted it. And these are a few of the people who testified who were from that neighborhood, including the late, great Sheila Masterson, who sadly passed away this past spring. The upshot has, I'm going to walk you through what the upshot of replacing parking minimums with parking maximums on Whaley Avenue has been for one particular affordable housing developer, St. Luke's Development Corporation, which is, whose board chair is right here, Dr. Sam Andow. Okay, so one affordable housing developer's experience, going to drill down pretty carefully and closely, but this is going to be relatively quick. So this is St. Luke's Church. It's an African-American Episcopalian church founded in the 1830s. It spun off of one of the Episcopalian churches on the Green because Black families were tired of being segregated into the back pews, and they founded their own church. It's been on this site ever since, although this building dates back, I think, to about the 1880s. It's right across the street from the Stop and Shop on Whaley Avenue. St. Luke's Development Corporation, which is affiliated with the church, owns, there's like a U-shaped parcel. It's an old garage right next door to the church that it intends to redevelop as affordable housing and first floor commercial. This is a sort of dated at this point rendering of what it will one day look like. The designs have changed over time, but that's kind of the point of this presentation. So St. Luke's has been working on this for about 10 years. Now, this is a sort of, you can sort of see the site here. Here's the Stop and Shop. Here's that U-Haul site. Now, in order to build housing, this is a survey. On the right here is Ferry Street, and on the bottom is Whaley Avenue. In order to build housing and commercial on this orange box on Whaley Avenue, in 2011, St. Luke's Development Corporation contracted to purchase this gray L-shaped area for parking. The whole darn thing for parking, because that's what the zoning would have required. And just to sort of zoom in on this yet more, this is what you do. This is a zoning analysis that you do when you're a developer seeking to build something. And just, oops, let's just zoom in on the parking aspect of this. You know, you add up what they wanted to do on the Whaley Avenue side, and you end up with an astronomical number of parking spaces. The the financial stack doesn't work in New Haven to do structured parking in this part of town. So you end up with surface parking, and that's where you end up buying a whole nother piece of land, almost the exact same size as your development site in order to do surface parking. So we're talking about 2011, 2012, they contract to purchase this site. Now, and to do it fully, it's just gonna be a parking lot. It's just gonna be a back parking lot on an otherwise residential street, which is Dickerman Street. Now, luckily, even back then in the old ages, we walked into City Hall and city plan staff said to us, we know the code says that you need to have 50 somewhat parking spaces, but we're not idiots. We don't want you to have 50 somewhat parking spaces. And the back of your site is this residential street, Dickerman Street, and it would suck for the people who live on Dickerman Street to live next to a giant parking lot. So how about we put like a two-family house basically here. It's proposed 5-story building, 4 units. So the 2013 version of the plan now includes, instead of 60 parking spaces, 24 parking spaces and these 4 units of housing. Even that though requires permission from the city. So the city plan staff will say to you, we don't really want all that parking, but can you please apply for relief not to have to do the parking? Luckily, SLDC has free lawyers in the form of the clinic that I teach at the law school. So it's not that big a deal for them, but for most developers, that's not a thing. And you've got to pay a lawyer. And you'll pay a lawyer to do this really stupid thing, which is show up at the Board of Zoning Appeals and make really fancy legal arguments, which in this case consisted of taking pictures of another affordable housing development that St. Luke's owns across the street and pointing out that on a Saturday afternoon, the parking lot at that affordable housing development was empty. And as a result, could we please not do that again and build another empty parking lot? Again, really sophisticated legal arguments that people will bill you $500 an hour to make. This is our client, again, Dr. Andow, and one of my former students before the BCA in the fall of 2013. Okay, great. So now I'm going to take you back to that commercial gateway. So affordable housing development's hard, and that thing that we've been trying to build since goodness knows when, since some of you were, in middle school, is still not built. We're still working on it. For better or worse, the commercial gateway corridor comes along. A bunch of folks who apparently really love parking kill the commercial gateway corridor on Dixwell Avenue and Grand Avenue, but on Whaley Avenue it goes through, partly because of advocacy for people like Dr. Randau and Sheila Masterson. So that parking maximum provision now applies to the site that SLDC continues to try to develop today. And what it means is that we've been able to redo our sketches. It is sketchy, and this is very preliminary, and the client's given me permission to tell you this whole story, but what I'm about to show you is not like a promise that this is what's going to get built. It is just a sense, giving you a sense of how things get better when you get rid of the parking minimums. And now we can think more along the lines of this. Where instead of putting 4 units of housing and 24 units on this back lot, we can put 24 units in open space on this back lot. And instead of putting a kind of like instead of putting a straight line building and a parking lot behind on Whaley Avenue, we can put an L-shaped building. We still need to do parking because we've got to have handicapped parking. You've got to have loading spaces. There are things that are necessary. But instead of having 12 spaces on that back lot, we're down to 6 or 8. And again, we can do more open and green space for the tenants in these buildings. It's just an illustration of what happens when you can decrease some of these parking minimums or eliminate them entirely. The missing piece here isn't necessarily convincing people in City Hall. They've tried this and not enough people showed up to encourage it and make it happen. In the corridor where people showed up and said, yes, we want this, it happened. And in the corridors where people said, in my neighborhood in Worcester Square, where all the NIMBYs showed up and said, no, it didn't happen. So this is my sort of clarion call to you all to show up and make it happen. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I feel like the New Haven example was really helpful, and we're right at 7 right now. So anyone who needs to leave, thank you so much for attending. And again, thank you so much to our speakers for coming out and talking to us. Anyone who can stay, we could use this time to maybe do a little Q&A if any of our speakers can stay, but please, no pressure if you can't. Otherwise, we can also go into some breakout rooms and think about, what this means, all of this information, process it together and come up with some action steps. Let's see, we do have some questions popping up in our chat. Let's see.
Yeah,
I can answer the question about the piecemeal process. If people, I'm just sort of looking at what's, the question was, is the effort to get rid of the minimums a piecemeal process? I think city plan, and I see Doug's on the call, he might have a sense of this. My understanding from city plan staff was that was sort of a toe in the water, see how it goes, and then go, try to do things more citywide. It didn't go well. So I think part of what groups like this are here for is to organize people so that next time it goes better. But when they came out with this, city hall staff is not necessarily, it just depends on the staff whether they're really good at local organizing. Oftentimes they're not, and they launched that stuff without having necessarily gotten, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I suspect there's appetite to try to do it again, maybe piecemeal, maybe not, I don't know, but I think that was the idea, was to do piecemeal, to do a little bit, hope that it will go well, went well, and then do more citywide stuff.
Hey, Anika, this is Aaron. Yes, you said a lot of the people that were against it were afraid of gentrification. I mean, obviously that's a pretty open term, and I think a lot of us, or a lot of people, define it differently. What were the specific fears? Was that they wouldn't have someplace to park, or that it was just going to result in increased rents, or?
The provision was the zone change included eliminating parking requirements, but also additional density. and it was a fear that additional density would result in gentrification. There's not any, I mean, that's not a thing that's empirically supported, but that was the story.
Let's see, Erin, there's a question from Leor about the city of Hartford parking minimums are only, wait, sorry, no, never mind. It was answered. There's a question from Kevin McCarthy. Has there been any pushback from like the disability community, and how do we sort of speak to the treatment of parking for people with disabilities? For anyone to answer.
This is Tony. I got a kind of a suggestion from Hartford. You know, some of it is just making sure that you don't lose ADA parking. And when you put the right price on things like street parking, it is more often available in front of the, you know, parallel parking directly in front of businesses where someone would need a short trip from their vehicle to the store. So, you know, for a vehicle-based person that needs ADA parking, you know, right priced parking and just making sure you have designated ADA parking, you know, are pretty straightforward ways to deal with that. And if you end up in any situations where you're pedestrianizing a street, having exceptions for, if possible, for, you know, ADA vehicles to get into those places can be helpful.
And I would just add to that, you know, I think Anika's example was a great one where they have dramatically improved the use of that site, yet they still have ADA parking there on site. One of the things that I kind of jumped over in the very last slide is some of the things that we've also started to try to think about here as it relates to our neighborhoods specifically is, can we better use the existing right-of-ways? So we have several fairly large one-way roads where we do alternate parking. So you have a 30-foot wide road, you have an 8-foot wide parking lane, and then you have a 22-foot wide travel lane, which most major streets, you only have 10 or 11-foot wide travel lanes. So we've started asking ourselves, what's the purpose of the alternate side parking? And is there a way to better utilize the existing right-of-way to provide more street parking? And so we've done that in some of our commercial corridors. And with that, you can then also, so Capitol Avenue, if you know Hartford at all, Capitol Avenue is a great example. We used to have 4 travel lanes, 2 in each direction. We now have knocked that down to 1 travel lane in each direction and taken those other 2 lanes and made parking for the businesses here, which also provided the ability to provide an ADA spot right in front of the businesses. So now we have more parking for the small businesses, slower traffic, and an ADA spot that's immediately accessible to the businesses here.
Just trying to keep up with what's going on in the chat. For the Hartford example, once those mins and maxes like went into place, what happened to existing parking? Was there a way to reduce like all of the existing parking that already was there?
Tony, do you want to talk about that? That's something I'll say is we're still working on.
Yeah, I can dive in. Zoning's slow. So zoning affects new things and developments in the future. And especially for a city like Hartford, we're not, you know, popping in any way relative to development. So we haven't seen like a wholesale development of parking lots. We've seen a few. We've had a few new apartment buildings that either didn't build any parking or, you know, used the lot next door, you know, that has evening and weekend emptiness. So we've had a few of those developments since the parking minimums came into place. We're trying right now to put a more appropriate price on parking, surface parking and garages. There's been a commercial parking lot ordinance on the books since 2002 that is like, you know, pennies a day per space as part of a commercial parking licensing and registration fee. And City Council is going to vote on an ordinance change that's going to raise that to 25 cents a day per space for both surface parking and garages. So we'll bring in a couple $100,000 for parking that we didn't have for maintenance in past years. And we're stepping that up in 2025 to 50 cents per day per space, and then up to $1 per day per space in 2030. So that'll start putting a little bit of price pressure on parking. I don't think it's enough to cause a fast shift away from parking land use, but it will at least get us some funds to address the very significant costs of wear and tear, enforcement, and we're not going to get anywhere near dealing with the environmental damage, but it's something that we were able to get City Council to support this year. So,
and one of the things that we did from a planning perspective specifically was also adopt several TODs, or transit-oriented development zones, that encourage even greater density immediately around some of our public transport corridors. And we've had several city and state officials advocating successfully with the state to fund and finally build the Hartford line, and fund and finally build the CT fast track. So, all of these things obviously have to work together. If we can give people other means of transportation that are accessible and affordable and regular, it also helps reduce the demand for parking lots, which ultimately helps reduce the need developers feel to build those. So, I think that's also an important advocacy component of this, is to continue to push for affordable, reliable, and just well maintained public transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Our biggest challenge in Hartford for parking, like the offenders, is the state of Connecticut and state of Connecticut employees and state of Connecticut unions. They've baked into the union contracts a paragraph, into every different union contract. It's the same paragraph that guarantees free parking and has no transit benefit or parking space buyout. And that's the largest employer in the state. New Haven's got some of that. You've also got some big institutions that are super parking hungry and probably have similar issues that where it's not necessarily commercial parking, but they're chewing up a lot of land.
So I want to be aware of time again. I feel like there's so much wonderful expertise and questions happening in the chat and in the discussion. But I do feel like it would be worth it for us to still break out into groups for anyone who's has the time and is able to stay, and we can sort of process in smaller groups some of the things that we just heard. And I think it would be helpful to frame, once we break out into groups, to think about what might be the biggest barrier, given everything that we've heard tonight. What's one big barrier that we're facing as advocates and as residents of New Haven or other cities in Connecticut? And then what's one potential solution or a way to overcome that barrier? And I'll give people like a minute just to regroup. And if you need to leave, thank you again so much for coming. And thanks one more time to our speakers. We will be able to collect all the questions in the chat, so we can sort of collect all the questions, and maybe if our speakers are able to address some of the things that have been raised in the chat, we can follow up. I'll also plug, before you leave, the Safe Streets Coalition of New Haven. We have a group-wide meeting every month. It's the third Wednesday from 6 to 7 p.m. So if this is something that sparks your interest and you haven't been to a meeting before, please come to our meetings. We're on Facebook, and we can post meeting information there. Okay. So looks like we're at about 25 participants. Max, would you want to split us up into breakout rooms?
And I'm sorry, I'm going to step away. I just want to say thanks again, and I'm definitely accessible by email for questions, or if I can offer any more, but I'm going to go spend a little time with the kids before bedtime. So
Excellent.
Appreciate
Thank
you all and
so
appreciate
much,
the work that you
Aaron.
guys are doing. So keep it up. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to create some rooms.
Aaron.
Yeah, please no pressure to stay. Thank you all again for coming.
Sorry, Andrew, you got put into a room all by yourself. So I've
Oh, okay. I figured something was up.
tried slotting you back into, did you get an invite for room 1 or something like that?
I didn't get an invite. I just started moving and moved back.
Okay, let me
Not
see.
on my volition.
Let me see if I can find your, oh, here.
Max, can you assign me again, please, sir?
Yeah, sorry.
about
One
That's okay.
moment. All right. Have you both gotten? Answers, are you there?